Welcome, dear listener. You've entered Audible Archives, a sanctuary of sound where lost tales awaken, your guide through these ancient echoes and timeless legends. So lean back, breathe deep, and let the story begin. This is Audible Archives, where every word holds a whisper of magic. This is Audible Archives. I'm Raul, your host, your writer, and the only witness left in rooms that echo with secrets. With each case, the shadows grow more confident, the enemies more cunning. In these next 4 investigations, S.R.H. isn't just solving crimes, he's unraveling the architecture of deception itself. These are cases 21 to 24, and the line between justice and survival is razor thin.
Case 21, The Final Betrayal. Detective Stephen Raul Hughes stood on the rooftop of a dilapidated building, the cool night air tugging at the collar of his coat. Below him, the city sprawled in a chaotic yet oddly beautiful mess of neon lights, flashing signs, and the distant hum of traffic. The faint scent of rain lingered in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of industry. This was the city that never slept, the city where secrets died hard and lived harder. But tonight, there was a silence that gripped the streets, one that even the city's usual cacophony couldn't penetrate. The kind of silence that comes only when something violent and irreversible has just occurred, a moment frozen in time. Hughes's sharp eyes scanned the scene below. The crime scene, lit by a halo of blue police lights, looked like something out of a noir film, a staged tableau. But this was real, far too real. The body of Victor Carrington, the CEO of a well-known private security firm, lay crumpled in the alleyway below, his throat slashed with brutal precision. Blood pooled around his body, spreading like a dark red flower against the cold pavement. His once imposing frame now seemed small, insignificant, a hollow shell of the man he had been. Carrington had made a name for himself in the world of high-end security, providing protection for politicians, billionaires, and celebrities. He was known for his ruthless efficiency, his cold demeanor, and the way he always stayed 3 steps ahead of his competitors. But none of that had saved him tonight. The body had been posed, carefully arranged. His arms were stretched out at odd angles, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. His black suit, now stained with blood, seemed out of place in the grime of the alley. But it was not just the way he had been killed that bothered Hughes, it was the note. Hughes's gaze drifted to the small piece of paper that had been placed beside Carrington's body. It was simple, almost childlike, but its implications were anything but innocent. 3 will fall, but only 1 will rise. The words burned in Hughes's mind, reverberating through the quiet of the night. 3? The implication was clear, this was only the first of many. A message, a warning, perhaps even a prophecy. But why? Why Carrington? And who was the one who would rise? Hughes stepped away from the edge, turning his attention to the officers below. They were working quickly, their movements efficient but tense. The crime scene was being processed, and the press would undoubtedly be swarming the area soon, eager for any morsel of information. It was only a matter of time before the media frenzy began. Detective Hughes. The voice of his partner, Detective Marcy Eastwood, echoed up from the stairwell. Hughes didn't have to turn to know that Eastwood was approaching. Her brisk footsteps told him everything he needed to know. Eastwood joined him at the edge of the roof, her eyes scanning the scene below. She was a no-nonsense detective, sharp as a blade and just as deadly when it came to solving cases. Another high-profile murder, Steve? She asked, her voice low, but laced with curiosity. Hughes nodded, his jaw tight. Carrington, he said, his voice flat. CEO of Carrington Security. He's been in the business for years. High-profile clients, plenty of enemies. He made a lot of people nervous. But there's more to this than just a hit. Eastwood studied the body below. You don't think it's a random hit? No, Hughes said, shaking his head. It's too deliberate. Too calculated. The way the body's arranged, the note, this wasn't just some thug with a knife looking for a payday. This is someone with a plan. Eastwood raised an eyebrow. A plan? You think this is the start of something bigger? I do, Hughes said. In the note, it's a warning. A statement. Whoever did this is sending a message to someone, or maybe several someones. The two detectives stood in silence for a moment, taking in the weight of the situation. Hughes could feel the unease creeping up on him, an instinct that he had learned to trust over the years. Something about this case didn't sit right with him. The city was used to violence, killings, betrayals, scandals. It was all part of the landscape. But this was different. He looked back at Eastwood. We need to dig into Carrington's life. Find out who he was involved with, who might want him dead. But more importantly, we need to figure out what this note means. Who are the other two who will fall? Eastwood nodded, her face hardening. You think this is personal? A revenge killing? Hughes took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene once more. No, it's not personal. It's something bigger. A conspiracy. I can feel it in my gut. Eastwood followed his gaze to the alley below. All right. I'll get the team on Carrington's background. See if anyone has a motive. What? You want to talk to the victim's associates? Family? Hughes didn't answer right away. His mind was already racing, following the threads of the investigation like a spider spinning a web. He needed to get ahead of this, before the city's corruption swallowed him whole, as it always had a tendency to do. I'll start with his business connections. The elite. Someone close to him might know something we don't. With that, Hughes turned and started down the stairwell, Eastwood at his heels. The crisp night air followed them as they descended into the depths of the city, the shadows growing longer with each step. As Hughes and Eastwood got into the unmarked car, the engine hummed to life, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The world outside was cold, indifferent, as though it had already moved on from the murder that had just occurred. But Hughes's mind was locked in on the cryptic message. 3 will fall. But only 1 will rise. The city was a labyrinth of lies and deception, and Hughes knew that this was only the first layer of the puzzle. But who was the one that would rise, and what did that mean for the city? As they drove through the streets, the noise of the city a distant murmur, Hughes's thoughts lingered on the note. The killer had a purpose, a plan that stretched beyond one victim. And Hughes had to find the answers before the second victim became a reality. Detective Stephen Raul Hughes stood in front of the flickering glow of his office computer, the dark silhouette of the city visible through the window. His mind was spinning as he sifted through a growing pile of evidence, a paper trail that led further down the rabbit hole than he ever anticipated. Carrington's murder wasn't an isolated event. It was the beginning of something much larger, something dangerous. Each lead revealed a deeper layer of corruption and deceit. One that made Hughes's gut churn with the knowledge of just how far-reaching this conspiracy went. Carrington had been more than just the CEO of a security firm. He had been a key player in a covert network, a clandestine operation involving high-ranking political figures, wealthy businessmen, and even mercenaries with no allegiance but to the highest bidder. His company, once a legitimate provider of protection services, had been the front for something far more sinister. Their dealings were international, involving arms deals, private intelligence, and discreet protection for clients whose names were rarely spoken in public circles. But Carrington wasn't the mastermind. He was merely a cog in a much larger machine. And now that he was dead, Hughes had to untangle the web he had helped weave. Carrington's been dealing with a lot more than just security contracts, Hughes muttered to himself as he examined more documents. Bank transfers, encrypted emails, names of international contacts, all leading to dark corners of the world that Hughes had hoped he would never have to see up close. Each lead pointed to a power struggle that involved much more than money. It was about control, influence, and revenge. His phone rang, the sound breaking through his thoughts. He picked it up immediately, recognizing the number. "Hughes," he answered. "It's Eastwood," came the voice on the other end. "You need to look into someone. A former agent. Tyler Vance." The name sent a chill down Hughes's spine. Vance was someone he had heard of, but had hoped never to encounter again. Vance had been a secret agent, a former operative with a reputation for being ruthless. He had worked for one of the country's most covert agencies, carrying out black ops and missions that were never meant to see the light of day. But that was until his career had come crashing down in a spectacular failure. "A disgraced former agent," Hughes muttered, leaning back in his chair. "What's his connection to Carrington?" "Vance and Carrington had a history," Eastwood explained. Vance was involved in several high-risk operations that Carrington's firm was providing security for. But something went wrong, and Vance was kicked out. He disappeared after that, but I'm hearing whispers that he might be back. Hughes leaned forward, a spark of interest igniting in his chest. A disgraced agent returning to settle a score was not uncommon in his line of work. And if Vance had a bone to pick with Carrington, it could explain the murder. "Any connection to the victims?" Hughes asked. Eastwood hesitated. "I don't know yet, but I think Carrington's death is just the first domino to fall. I'll pull his file, see what I can find." Hughes hung up the phone and turned back to the stack of files on his desk. His instincts were screaming at him. Vance was tied to this, and somehow, he was one of the three who would fall. But there was still a missing piece of the puzzle. Who was the third person? Who else had Carrington crossed? It wasn't long before Eastwood sent over Vance's file. Hughes quickly scanned through it, searching for any link to Carrington. It wasn't long before he found something. Tyler Vance had been assigned to a mission several years ago, one that had gone terribly wrong. He and Carrington had worked together on a sensitive assignment involving a foreign government, intelligence agents, and a private deal for weapons and security services. The mission was supposed to be smooth, a simple operation where Carrington's security team would provide protection, but something had gone awry. Vance's team had failed to secure the area, resulting in the deaths of several operatives and the loss of critical intelligence. Carrington had pulled the plug on the mission, leaving Vance to take the fall. The disgrace was enough to end Vance's career, and he was forced into hiding after his reputation was tarnished. He had vanished from public sight, becoming little more than a shadow of his former self. But now, Hughes had a new theory. If Vance had returned, he would undoubtedly want revenge on Carrington for ruining his life. And if the cryptic note Carrington had left was to be believed, then Vance was one of the 3 who would fall. 3 will fall, but only 1 will rise. Hughes repeated the words to himself as he stared at the file. Was Vance the one who would rise? Had he orchestrated this entire series of murders to get his revenge on those who had wronged him? Hughes, Eastwood's voice crackled through his phone again, pulling him out of his thoughts. I've got something on Vance. He's been spotted at a few high-profile locations over the past week. He's not hiding anymore. He's making moves. Hughes's pulse quickened. Where? He's been seen at a few private meetings with Carrington's former associates. People in the security world. And I'm hearing rumors that he's trying to get back into the game, perhaps with a bigger role this time. Hughes's mind raced. If Vance was attempting to re-enter the game, it could mean that the stakes were even higher than he had initially thought. And if the note had meant anything, it wasn't just Carrington who was in danger, it was the entire network. Get the team on it, Hughes instructed. I want to know where Vance is and what he's planning. We need to find him before he makes his move. As Hughes hung up the phone, he felt the weight of the investigation settle heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just a murder case anymore. This was a ticking time bomb, and he was the one tasked with defusing it. 3 would fall, but only 1 would rise. The question now was, would it be Vance, Carrington, or someone else entirely? Hughes closed his eyes for a moment, thinking about the larger implications of everything he had uncovered so far. He had to keep digging, and he had to do it fast. He wasn't sure who the final player in this dangerous game was, but one thing was certain, no one was safe, and the stakes were only getting higher. Detective Stephen Raul Hughes stood alone in the dim light of the secluded cabin, the smell of damp wood and stale air clinging to the walls. His heart pounded in his chest as his eyes scanned the sparse surroundings. Vance had clearly been here recently. Everything was in disarray, as though the man had left in a hurry. Yet, despite the chaos of the cabin, there was no sign of the elusive former agent. He walked cautiously across the room, his boots making soft thuds against the wooden floor. On a desk, amidst a pile of discarded papers and empty coffee cups, lay an old laptop. Hughes moved toward it, his fingers brushing the keys to power it on. The screen flickered before coming to life, revealing an encrypted folder that made his pulse race. It was exactly what he had been searching for, proof of Vance's involvement and, perhaps, the final piece to understanding the twisted web of betrayal. He clicked on the folder, only to be met with a password prompt. His mind raced as he studied the computer in front of him. If Vance had left this behind intentionally, there might be a chance the password was something personal. Hughes tried several combinations, each one more desperate than the last. And then, with a sinking feeling, he tried a name, Carrington. The screen blinked and opened, revealing a file labeled Project Hydra. The files inside the folder made Hughes's blood run cold. Carrington, the now-dead businessman, had been deeply involved in a covert operation that stretched across international borders. The operation, Project Hydra, had been a deal involving classified government secrets, cutting-edge military technology, and high-value weaponry. The trade had been handled by a network of power players, spies, government officials, military contractors, and it had all collapsed when Carrington had betrayed them by selling information to the highest bidder. Vance's name appeared repeatedly in the documents. He had been involved in Project Hydra from the beginning, tasked with overseeing security and ensuring the safe delivery of sensitive material. But Carrington's betrayal had been the catalyst that had broken everything apart. And now Vance, knowing that his reputation had been tarnished by the failure, was making his move to dismantle the very network that had once relied on him. Hughes exhaled sharply as he leaned over the computer, processing the gravity of what he had just uncovered. This wasn't just about Carrington's death anymore. It was about an international conspiracy that could shake the foundations of governments. The classified secrets Carrington had stolen, combined with the weapons he had sold, were worth more than the lives of those who had betrayed him. But there was one more piece to this puzzle, one person who had ties to both Carrington and Vance. A name that had appeared multiple times in the encrypted files, Alexandra Kane, a high-profile lawyer whose connections spanned across the legal and political elite. She had been the go-between for Carrington's illegal dealings, the mediator who facilitated the deals that had led to Carrington's downfall. Kane's role in Project Hydra had been clear. She had arranged the meetings, written the contracts, and ensured that the deals went smoothly. But what about her role in the murder of Carrington? Or the other two victims? Hughes couldn't shake the feeling that Kane was somehow more involved in this than anyone realized. She wasn't just a lawyer, she was the key to understanding the deeper conspiracy. If she had facilitated Carrington's betrayal, could she also have been the one pulling the strings of Vance's vendetta? Hughes leaned back against the desk, a wave of frustration washing over him. He had been running on empty for days, and the weight of the case was starting to wear him down. He needed to find Kane, but he didn't know where to begin. She had all the power and resources to stay hidden, and Hughes had to tread carefully. He had no idea if she was pulling the strings behind this entire operation or if she had been merely another pawn in Vance's twisted game of revenge. As if on cue, Hughes's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw Eastwood's name flashing on the screen. He answered quickly. "Hughes, I've found something," Eastwood said, her voice tight with urgency. "I got a lead on Kane. She's been spotted at several meetings with people who are tied to Carrington's firm. I've also tracked her down to a private yacht docked at the city marina. We don't know what she's up to, but she's been making moves." A surge of adrenaline hit Hughes. This could be the breakthrough he needed, the moment that would finally unravel the conspiracy. "Set up surveillance," Hughes instructed. "I'm on my way." He grabbed his coat, his mind already calculating the next move. If Kane was at the marina, it was likely she was preparing for something big. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but Hughes had to be careful. The stakes were higher than ever, and if Kane was truly behind everything, she wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to protect herself. As Hughes made his way to the marina, he couldn't shake the feeling that the true mastermind was still hidden in the shadows, watching as the players fell one by one. Vance was a player in this game, but so was Kane, and neither one would stop until they had claimed victory. The note Carrington had left behind still echoed in Hughes's mind: 3 will fall, but only 1 will rise. But as the investigation deepened, Hughes knew one thing for certain: he would stop at nothing to ensure that the right person fell in the end. The second body had been found in the early hours of the morning, tucked away in the opulence of Alexandra Kane's penthouse apartment. She was a woman who had built her life on manipulation and control, a power player in a world where everyone had their price. But now, she was just another victim, a woman strangled in her own home, her life snuffed out in a brutal fashion. The scene felt almost too familiar, too predictable. The only thing that remained unchanged was the note, found on her coffee table, resting just inches from her lifeless hand: 3 will fall, but only 1 will rise. Hughes stood in the penthouse, staring at the cold note. The words sent a chill down his spine. He'd seen it before, with Carrington. The killer's message was clear: this was no ordinary crime. The victims were being chosen carefully, each one falling like a domino in a game of vengeance. But what about the third? Was it Vance, or had someone else already paid the price? Eastwood stood beside him, her arms crossed, her brow furrowed. "So, it's Kane," she said, her voice a mix of frustration and disbelief. The lawyer who thought she could play both sides of the game. But the game doesn't play her. Hughes didn't respond at first. His mind was already working through the evidence, the connections. Kane had been a linchpin in the conspiracy, negotiating deals between Carrington and his associates, brokered through back-channel meetings with high-ranking military contractors, mercenaries, and government officials. She had ties to everyone involved in Project Hydra, the operation that had brought Carrington down. But what Hughes hadn't anticipated was how far Kane had gone to protect herself from the fallout. She had been playing both sides, using Vance to eliminate Carrington, hoping to shift the blame entirely onto him. And she had failed. Carrington was dead, but Kane had only managed to bring herself closer to her own death. Hughes stepped over the body, his eyes scanning the apartment for clues, his mind unraveling the twisted threads of this conspiracy. Kane had been many things: manipulative, calculating, and ambitious. But had she really believed she could emerge unscathed? Had she underestimated the power of those who had been double-crossed? What happened to her? Eastwood asked, breaking Hughes's concentration. She was strangled, same as Carrington, Hughes muttered. The killer's MO was clear. But Kane didn't just get unlucky. She was the one who thought she could control the game. The note, it's the same message Carrington received. 3 will fall, but only 1 will rise. But who's the third? And who's rising? Eastwood was silent for a moment, before stepping closer. "What if it's not Vance?" she suggested, her voice low. "What if the third victim isn't dead yet? What if it's you?" Hughes froze, her words hanging heavy in the air. He turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "Me? Why would I be the target?" "Because you've been digging into things no one wants you to dig into," she replied. "You've gotten too close to the truth, Steve. You're unraveling this whole operation, and someone is bound to make sure you stop." Hughes didn't respond immediately, his thoughts racing. It was a plausible theory, but it felt wrong. The killer wasn't just targeting anyone who got in the way. The pattern was clear: Carrington, Kane, and then who? The third victim had to be someone integral to the whole conspiracy. Someone who had more than just a passing connection to the web of deceit and betrayal. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from Eastwood's source at the marina. "Vance," Hughes muttered under his breath, his fingers quickly tapping out a reply. "We need to find him before he becomes the third victim, or worse, the next killer." As Hughes and Eastwood made their way to the marina, a growing sense of urgency filled the air. The investigation had shifted once again. The pieces of the puzzle weren't just falling into place, they were becoming a trap. Vance, Carrington, Kane, these people were all pawns in a larger game, but who was orchestrating it all? Who was the unseen hand controlling the fate of these victims? The further Hughes pushed into the dark corners of the conspiracy, the more he realized just how deep this went. Carrington's betrayal, Kane's manipulation, Vance's thirst for revenge, it was all part of something much larger. and someone had made sure that no one would rise above the rest. Everyone had to fall. They reached the marina, a dark stretch of water dotted with boats and yachts, the silence broken only by the sound of waves lapping against the docks. Hughes felt his instincts flaring. Vance had been elusive, but there was no way he would just disappear completely. He had left a trail. If Hughes could follow it, it might lead him to the third victim, or perhaps to the final confrontation. "I've been tracking Vance's movements," Eastwood said, pulling out a map. "He's been meeting with someone on one of the yachts. We've got a location." Hughes nodded, pulling his coat tighter against the biting cold. The final act of this twisted drama was about to unfold, and he wasn't going to let anyone else die before he had the truth in his hands. Kane had played her part in this deception, but now the game was reaching its climax. It was time to put an end to it. As they moved toward the docked yacht, Hughes couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the real deception wasn't just about the murders, it was about who had masterminded the entire operation. Vance was only a pawn, and Kane had been too blinded by her own ambition to see the true enemy. And now, Hughes had to stop them both before the final victim fell, and the last one rose. The abandoned warehouse loomed in front of Hughes, its rusted exterior and shattered windows casting long, jagged shadows across the broken pavement. This was the endgame. The final confrontation had been set in motion by countless players, and now, all paths led here. Every step Hughes took toward the entrance weighed heavier than the last. He could feel the pressure mounting, a sense of finality that threatened to close in around him. This was it, the moment when everything would be exposed, when the last puzzle piece would either fit perfectly into place or shatter everything. Inside, the air was thick with tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Hughes had tracked Vance to this warehouse, following a trail of encrypted messages, odd bank transfers, and clandestine meetings with mercenaries. But he had been careful. He didn't just want to arrest Vance. He needed the full story, the entire truth, and he knew it lay within Vance's mind. As Hughes stepped into the warehouse, the cold light of a flickering overhead bulb illuminated the silhouette of Vance, leaning against a rusted steel beam. His arms were crossed, his face set in a grim expression. Vance had been expecting him. "You're too late," Vance said, his voice carrying a bitter edge. His eyes glinted in the dim light. "You don't understand the game." Hughes didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady as he slowly advanced, his hand hovering just above his holster. The air in the warehouse seemed to thicken, as if it too was waiting for the inevitable collision. "I understand more than you think," Hughes replied evenly, his voice low but firm. "You were never the real target. Carrington and Kane? Just pawns in a much bigger scheme." Vance's posture stiffened, his narrowed eyes focusing sharply on Hughes. "What do you mean?" Hughes' jaw tightened as he took a deep breath, letting the weight of the revelation sink in. "The note. 3 will fall, but only 1 will rise. It wasn't about you, or Kane, or Carrington. It was about the ones who are still at the top. The ones who have been playing both sides all along. You were just a pawn in their game." Vance's breath hitched for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "No, it can't be," he muttered, the tremor of doubt creeping into his voice. "You're wrong." But Hughes had pieced it together, his mind racing through all the clues that had slowly revealed the larger conspiracy. Vance had been used to eliminate Carrington and Kane, both of whom had been targeted because of their involvement in a far-reaching operation that dealt in weapons, government secrets, and high-level corruption. But Vance was never the mastermind. He had been a casualty of the system, a disgraced agent seeking revenge, manipulated by forces much stronger than his own personal vendetta. The truth was clear now, but Vance refused to believe it. "I'm not wrong, Vance," Hughes said, his voice hardening. "The people who have been pulling the strings, the ones orchestrating everything from the shadows, they're still in power. And they're not done yet." As Hughes finished speaking, the warehouse doors creaked open, the low rumble echoing through the space. A shadow moved from beyond the doorframe, and Hughes's gaze snapped toward the figure stepping into the dim light. His heart sank as the familiar outline of a political figure took shape, a man whose name had never appeared in the investigation, but whose influence reached far beyond the scope of Carrington's operations. It was then that Hughes understood the full scale of the deception. The killer, the true mastermind, was standing right in front of him. The figure in the doorway smiled coldly. "Hughes," the man said, his voice smooth and controlled, "I'm glad you could make it. It's time to finish this." Hughes's pulse quickened. The man standing before him was none other than Jonathan Hale, a high-ranking politician with deep connections to the intelligence community, government contracts, and defense industry. Hale had always maintained a public image of integrity, a politician who fought for the people. But Hughes knew better now. Hale had been the puppet master all along, orchestrating the downfall of Carrington, Kane, and Vance to ensure that his own power would remain unchallenged. Hale had played both sides, using Carrington's security company as a front to broker deals for military technology, manipulating Kane to cover up the illicit activities, and now using Vance as a pawn to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. All this time, Hughes muttered under his breath, the shock settling in. "You've been playing us all." Vance looked between Hughes and Hale, the realization dawning on him. I was never supposed to win, was I?" he asked, the anger in his voice mixing with regret. "No," Hale replied, his voice smooth, without a hint of remorse. "You were never meant to win, Vance. You were meant to eliminate my competition and leave the city with no one to challenge my power." Hughes could feel the weight of the moment settling in. The truth had finally been exposed, and it was worse than he had ever imagined. This wasn't just a political scandal, it was a carefully orchestrated series of murders designed to consolidate power, erase those who threatened Hale's control, and ensure his rise to the top. With a sudden movement, Hughes's hand shot to his holster, his fingers wrapping around the cold metal of his gun. But before he could react, Hale raised his hand, signaling for his guards to step forward. "You're too late, Detective," Hale said, his voice a mixture of amusement and cold finality. "There's nothing left for you here." But Hughes wasn't ready to give up. He had come too far, uncovered too much, to let it all end here. In that instant, he made a decision. He wasn't going to leave this warehouse empty-handed. Someone had to pay for what had happened to Carrington, Kane, Vance, and the countless others who had fallen prey to Hale's machinations. A gunshot rang out, deafening in the silence. It wasn't from Hughes's gun. Hale's guards crumpled to the floor, one after another, each shot precise, professional. From the shadows, a figure emerged, someone Hughes hadn't expected. It was Eastwood, her gun still smoking in her hand. "I knew you wouldn't finish this alone," she said, her voice calm, but laced with determination. "You were right. Hale's the one behind this. Let's take him down together." With Eastwood's backup, the two detectives quickly overpowered Hale's remaining guards. In the chaos, Hughes moved toward Hale, his eyes fixed on the man who had orchestrated it all. "You thought you were untouchable," Hughes said, his voice steely. "But the game's over." With a final push, Hughes tackled Hale to the ground, the weight of the conspiracy crashing down on both of them. It wasn't just about taking down one man, it was about stopping the dangerous web of corruption that had threatened to consume everything in its path. As Hughes watched Hale's arrest unfold, he couldn't shake the feeling that this case, this victory, was only the beginning. The conspiracy had been far-reaching, but Hale was just a piece of it. There were others who had been pulling the strings from the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity to rise. And as he walked away from the case, Hughes knew one thing for certain: the fight was far from over. The shadows of the conspiracy would linger, always waiting for the next game to begin. Case 22, The Vanishing Corpse. Detective Stephen Raul Hughes stood in the opulent foyer of Lord Frederick Lamont's penthouse, his eyes scanning the scene. The apartment was a blend of old-world charm and modern luxury, with chandeliers glimmering overhead and a fireplace crackling softly in the corner. Yet, despite the wealth and beauty surrounding him, the air was thick with an unsettling chill. It was a feeling Hughes had become all too familiar with, the prelude to a mystery that would stretch his intellect and his patience to their limits. A body had been discovered in the bath. Or, at least, there had been. The thing was, by the time the police had arrived on the scene, the body had vanished. Only a large, blood-stained towel and an overturned chair remained in the lavish bathroom. The apartment, which should have been filled with signs of a violent struggle, showed no such marks, no shattered glass, no signs of forced entry, nothing that could suggest the presence of an intruder. It was a riddle wrapped in an enigma, and Hughes, ever the methodical investigator, immediately saw that things were not as they seemed. Hughes stepped into the bathroom, his sharp eyes taking in the details. The walls were lined with imported marble, gleaming under the soft light. The bath itself, a large, claw-footed tub, looked entirely undisturbed, save for the pool of blood around the drain, now mostly dried. There were no signs of struggle in the water or on the tile floor, though there should have been no blood splatter, no disturbed objects. He crouched down by the drain, his fingers tracing the edges of the bloodstain. It was the first place where his mind started to weave the pattern of the crime. Blood had pooled here, and yet, there were no splashes, no spatter on the surrounding tiles, nothing to suggest that the victim had been killed in the bath itself. "Hughes, you need to see this," called Officer Harris from the doorway. Hughes stood and walked back into the bedroom, his thoughts already piecing together the events of the last few hours. The body had been moved, that much was clear, but why? Who had the access and the ability to carry out such a feat in a place like this without anyone noticing? And, most importantly, why had the body been taken? Harris was holding a blood-stained towel in his gloved hands, and Hughes felt a sharp pang of unease in his stomach. It was the only trace left of the victim, no body, no blood in the tub, but a large towel with blood splotches on it, just discarded carelessly on the floor near the chair. "This is what was left behind, sir," Harris said grimly. "No signs of anyone else being here, no fingerprints except for the victim's. Nothing that could give us a lead on how the body vanished." Hughes reached for the towel and examined it carefully. It was large, plush, and of high quality, though it looked ordinary enough, except for the dark red stain that had soaked into the fibers. What disturbed him most was the way the towel was carelessly thrown aside, as if someone had been in a hurry. Who discovered the body? Hughes asked, not lifting his gaze from the towel. The maid, Miss Greta. She claims she didn't see anything unusual. Just the usual cleaning chores. Found the blood, then called us. Hughes turned, studying the maid's statement. And she didn't hear any sounds of a struggle? No yelling or crashing? No, sir. She says she didn't hear anything out of the ordinary. Hughes stepped toward the living room, his mind working through the possibilities. His thoughts began to focus on the room itself. The decor was elegant but understated, a rich man's taste, nothing overly flashy, just a wealth of subtlety and refinement. The kind of place where nothing out of place would go unnoticed. Nothing except for a dead body that had vanished. The door to the balcony was wide open, the cool evening air drifting in, causing the curtains to flutter slightly. Hughes moved toward it, squinting as he looked down at the street below. From the height of the apartment, he could see the entire block, but nothing stood out. No one was milling about on the street, no signs of activity that would explain how a body could disappear into thin air. Hughes's thoughts were interrupted by a soft tap on the doorframe. A woman, probably in her early 30s, entered the room hesitantly. Her appearance was impeccable, dark hair pulled back neatly, a suit of deep blue that suggested wealth and refinement, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something that made Hughes pause. "I am Lady Eleanor Grey," she said quietly. "Lord Lamont's fiancée." Hughes nodded, his sharp eyes assessing her. "Fiancée?" he repeated, his tone neutral. "Yes," she continued, stepping further into the room, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. "I was here last night, and I left this morning before anything happened. I don't understand. What happened to Frederick?" Hughes's gaze softened slightly, but he did not offer her any assurances. "We're still investigating, Lady Grey. But it seems that something went terribly wrong." I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice trembling. "He was perfectly fine when I left. He was in good health. There's no reason anyone would hurt him." Hughes didn't respond immediately, but instead, he studied her closely, noticing the faint shadow of worry beneath her composed exterior. She was distressed, but not in the way one might expect from someone who had just lost a loved one. Her concern felt measured. "Did Lord Lamont have any enemies, Lady Grey?" Hughes asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. Lady Grey hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly as she fiddled with the edge of her sleeve. I don't think so. Frederick was well liked by everyone. He had a few business dealings, but nothing that would indicate danger. He was very careful with whom he associated." Hughes wasn't convinced. The story didn't add up. Everything about Lamont's life seemed too neat, too perfect. A man with no apparent enemies, no issues, and yet, here he was, dead, or at least, nearly dead, leaving only a pool of blood and a towel. Did Lord Lamont have any unusual behavior recently? Hughes pressed. Anything that might explain this? Anything out of the ordinary? Lady Grey's gaze shifted, as if the question caught her off guard. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly before she shook her head. No, nothing unusual. He was the same as always. But Hughes had already formed a theory. The body had been moved, and someone had been very careful about it. The question was, why? The deeper Detective Stephen Raul Hughes delved into Lord Frederick Lamont's life, the more it seemed that Lamont was not the simple bachelor he appeared to be. his polished image of a well-liked, upstanding citizen began to crack, revealing a labyrinth of mystery, eccentricity, and, possibly, danger. Hughes had spent the better part of the morning interviewing everyone connected to Lamont, staff, colleagues, business partners, but no one had anything particularly useful to offer. The consensus was the same: Lamont was liked by everyone. He had no enemies, no contentious relationships, and no history of violent conflict. The people who knew him described him as charming and reserved, with a particular penchant for the avant-garde and unusual. He was someone who lived in the world of high society but always appeared to walk on the edge of it, with interests that bordered on the bizarre. But Hughes's instincts told him there was more to Lamont's life than met the eye. In his search of the penthouse, Hughes had found a curious collection of objects that hinted at a far darker side to the wealthy bachelor. On one of the bookshelves, hidden beneath stacks of books on obscure art history, was a carefully curated selection of oddities, antique masks, bizarre sculptures, and ancient trinkets from foreign lands. Some were beautiful, others grotesque, but they all had an air of mystery about them. It was clear that Lamont's interest in the unusual had extended far beyond simple collection. It was a consuming obsession. One of the items that caught Hughes's attention was a small, weathered scroll of parchment that had been tucked inside a leather-bound book on obscure rituals. The scroll was written in a language Hughes didn't recognize, but its presence suggested a deeper involvement with something more sinister. But it was the invitation he found among Lamont's papers that truly piqued his curiosity. The invitation was elegantly designed, printed on heavy parchment, and adorned with a wax seal. It was addressed to a select group of individuals, each one a prominent figure in the world of rare art, antiquities, and high society. The invitation read, "You are cordially invited to an evening of the avant-garde and the unknown. The art of living, a night of art, mystery, and indulgence, by invitation only." Hughes turned the invitation over, his gaze narrowing as he read the names of those invited. Lord Lamont was listed prominently, but more interestingly, so was a name that had come up in several of the interviews: Eleanor Grant. Eleanor Grant was an enigma. The name had been mentioned repeatedly, but none of Lamont's associates seemed to know much about her. She had been absent from the investigation, and none of the staff at the penthouse remembered her ever visiting. Yet, her name appeared in connection with Lamont's wealth and influence, and she seemed to be a key player in his life. Hughes's instincts told him that Grant was not only significant to the case but might be the key to unraveling the mystery of Lamont's disappearance. Hughes began to dig into Grant's background, and what he found only added to the mystery. Eleanor Grant was a woman of few public appearances, yet she had been involved with some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the world of rare artifacts and art. She was known for hosting private gatherings for an exclusive club of wealthy men and women, people who specialized in the acquisition of rare, often forbidden objects. These gatherings were notoriously secretive, with invitations extended only to those considered worthy of the club's inner circle. The theme of each event? The art of living dangerously. It was an odd phrase, but one that resonated in the context of Lamont's life. Was this club connected to the mysterious disappearance of the body? Could it be that Lamont, drawn into this high-stakes world of rare and dangerous objects, had found himself in over his head? Grant's name kept resurfacing in Hughes's investigation, and the more he uncovered, the more it became apparent that she wasn't just a collector of art, she was a curator of secrets. Her ability to vanish for weeks at a time without leaving any trace of her whereabouts only deepened her mystique. Her connections in the world of antiquities and rare artifacts, however, made her a person of considerable interest. Hughes's investigation revealed that Grant had been the one to introduce Lamont to the world of cursed objects and forbidden art. It was she who had convinced him to purchase several obscure pieces, including an ancient dagger that had reportedly been passed down through the ages, a dagger said to bring misfortune to its owner. Lamont had laughed it off as superstition, but he had bought it nonetheless. Why? As Hughes studied the details of the invitation and the collection of rare artifacts, a chilling thought crossed his mind. Had Lamont's fascination with these objects, especially the more dangerous ones, led him to his demise? Had he crossed paths with something, or someone, that he couldn't control? Hughes reached out to several art dealers and experts in the field of rare antiquities. One name kept coming up, Raul Demetrius, a man with ties to Eleanor Grant and the high society circle that frequently attended these secretive gatherings. Demetrius was known for his ruthless business practices, dealing in illicit art and artifacts that many believed should never be sold. Hughes needed to speak with him, but finding Demetrius wouldn't be easy. He had a reputation for disappearing as effortlessly as Grant did, but Hughes wasn't about to let that stop him. The next step was clear. Hughes had to confront Eleanor Grant. Her connection to Lamont and the world of rare artifacts made her the prime suspect in the case. Was she involved in the strange disappearance of Lamont's body? Or was she just a player in a much larger, more dangerous game? With his team gathering information on Demetrius's whereabouts, Hughes made the decision to pay Grant a visit. He was certain that the answers he sought lay with her. Whether she would be willing to give them up was another matter entirely. But Hughes wasn't about to let anything slip through his fingers. The investigation was only just beginning, and the deeper he went, the more it seemed that the stakes were far higher than anyone had realized. Lamont's disappearance was just the beginning of a much larger mystery, one that could cost more lives before the truth was finally uncovered. As Hughes left the penthouse, the words of the invitation echoed in his mind, an evening of the avant-garde and the unknown. What was the unknown? And what dangers had Lamont, with his penchant for the strange and the forbidden, stumbled into? Hughes wasn't sure, but he was determined to find out. Days passed, and Detective Stephen Raul Hughes found himself at a standstill. Despite his tireless pursuit of every lead, the case surrounding Lord Frederick Lamont's mysterious death remained an enigma. The body had vanished, and the only tangible evidence left behind was a blood-stained towel and an overturned chair. Lord Lamont's social circle remained tight-lipped, and his enigmatic connection to Eleanor Grant only deepened the mystery. Then, one morning, Hughes received an anonymous letter that would change the course of the investigation. The letter was elegantly written, the ink slightly smudged, as if it had been penned in haste. No return address, no signature, just a description of a secret, late-night auction hosted by none other than Eleanor Grant. The letter made one particular reference that caught Hughes's attention, a painting called The Corpse, described as a twisted and powerful piece of art, rumored to be inspired by a long-lost masterpiece. The letter also mentioned that the painting had been sold for an astronomical sum, far exceeding its estimated value. The letter hinted that the auction and the mysterious painting might be linked to the murder of Lord Lamont. The description suggested that the painting had an aura of madness and despair around it, an aura that could drive people to the edge of insanity. It seemed too coincidental for Hughes to ignore. Could this be the missing piece of the puzzle? Was there more to Lamont's death than a simple disappearance? Hughes's mind raced as he pondered the possibilities. The idea that a painting, an inanimate object, could hold such power seemed outlandish at first. Yet, considering the strange events surrounding Lamont's life and the elusive nature of Eleanor Grant, Hughes couldn't dismiss the connection so easily. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that the painting might have played a pivotal role in Lamont's death, and possibly in the strange disappearance of his body. Determined to find out more, Hughes decided to attend the auction himself. He knew that his usual methods of investigation, interviewing witnesses, searching for clues, hadn't yielded any significant breakthroughs. Perhaps this clandestine gathering, shrouded in secrecy and surrounded by the world of rare and expensive art, held the key to uncovering the truth. The auction was set to take place late that evening in a nondescript building, tucked away in one of the city's less-traveled districts. Hughes, always resourceful, secured an invitation by posing as a bidder with a keen interest in rare art. Disguised in a plain suit, with a careful attempt to blend in, he entered the venue with cautious steps. The room was dimly lit, filled with the soft murmur of whispers. The air was thick with tension, as though the very walls of the building were holding secrets, dark and heavy, waiting to be exposed. The attendees, mostly wealthy elites and collectors, milled about the room, eyeing the various pieces of art that were to be sold. The atmosphere was hushed, reverent, and yet there was an undercurrent of unease. Hughes felt it immediately, the gnawing sense that something was terribly wrong. He spotted Eleanor Grant near the back of the room, her presence magnetic even in the shadows. She was elegantly dressed in a black gown, her eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that suggested she was more than just an observer. She wasn't there to merely sell art, she was orchestrating something far more complicated. Her association with Lamont and the mysterious artifacts that had once filled his penthouse now seemed even more ominous. As Hughes surveyed the room, his gaze was drawn to the centerpiece of the auction, the corpse. The painting was displayed at the front of the room, draped under a velvet cloth until the time came for the bidding to start. It was a haunting piece, dark, twisted, and grotesque. The brushstrokes seemed almost alive, as if the painting itself was a living thing, writhing in agony. The subject was an abstract figure, a distorted, skeletal man, lying in a bath of blood. His features were barely discernible, but there was a palpable sense of horror in the way the figure was posed, unnatural, almost as if it had been captured at the moment of death. Hughes could feel his skin prickle as he gazed at the painting. The air around it seemed charged, heavy with an unspoken power. There was something about the way the painting was displayed, the reverence with which the attendees looked at it, that made Hughes uneasy. He had seen many works of art in his time, but never one that seemed to carry such an oppressive weight. The painting, it seemed, was more than just an artwork. It was a symbol of death, of loss, and perhaps, of something far darker. As the auction began, Hughes kept a careful watch on the attendees. He noted the nervous glances exchanged between the bidders, the way they seemed to hesitate before raising their paddles. The bidding for the corpse started slowly, but it quickly escalated. The price soared, much higher than Hughes had expected for a piece of art that was, by all accounts, unremarkable in its provenance, except for its reputation. The atmosphere became more charged as the auction progressed, and when the final bid was made, Hughes was surprised to see none other than Raul Demetrius, the unscrupulous art dealer he had been investigating, place the winning bid. Demetrius was well known for his dealings in illicit art, and his presence here confirmed Hughes's suspicions. The auction wasn't just about art. It was about something far more dangerous. Eleanor Grant stepped forward to congratulate Demetrius on his purchase, her smile tight, her eyes flickering with something that could almost be called a warning. Hughes's instincts screamed that she knew more than she was letting on. The connection between the auction, the painting, and Lamont's death was becoming undeniable. As the evening wore on, Hughes's mind raced with questions. Could the painting be tied to Lamont's death in some way? Was it the key to understanding the bizarre disappearance of the body? Had the artwork somehow symbolized the murder, its twisted and haunting nature mirroring the tragedy that had befallen Lamont? But what struck Hughes most was the sudden, unsettling realization: the painting wasn't just an artwork. It was a message. The victim, the disappearance of the body, the strange atmosphere in the room, everything seemed to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. The painting, the corpse, was more than a mere object. It was a reflection of the crime itself. It wasn't just a painting of death, it was a map, a guide to understanding the events that had led to Lord Lamont's untimely end. The question was, who had commissioned the painting? Who had crafted it to such a chilling degree? And, more importantly, who had the power to make such a twisted piece of art disappear, just like the body of Lord Lamont? Hughes knew that he was on the cusp of uncovering something monumental, something far darker than he had anticipated. He had followed the clues to the auction, but they were only the beginning. The true depth of the mystery lay hidden in the connections between Eleanor Grant, Raul Demetrius, and the sinister world of rare art and forbidden objects. It was clear now, the game had changed, and Hughes was no longer just investigating a murder. He was investigating a conspiracy, one that could destroy the lives of everyone involved. The night was far from over, and the twisted web was only just beginning to unravel. As Detective Stephen Raul Hughes delved deeper into the twisted mystery surrounding Lord Frederick Lamont's death and the vanishing body, his determination to uncover the truth led him down a darker and more complex path than he had ever imagined. Each clue he unearthed pointed toward one conclusion: Eleanor Grant was at the center of it all, pulling the strings in a sinister game that involved not only rare art but also manipulation, betrayal, and murder. But as Hughes sifted through the layers of deception, a chilling realization dawned upon him. The murder of Lord Lamont was not a murder at all. It had been a meticulously orchestrated hoax, a grand illusion created by none other than Eleanor Grant herself. The body in the bath was never Lamont's. It wasn't even a real corpse. The victim, whose identity had been carefully concealed, had been placed in the bath to create the illusion of a grisly crime. The bloodstains, the overturned chair, the absence of the body, all of it had been part of Grant's carefully calculated plan. During the night, while the police were distracted by the discovery of the gruesome scene, the body had been secretly removed, leaving only traces of the hoax behind. Grant had orchestrated the entire ruse to manipulate those in her social circle, powerful individuals who had long been in awe of her mysterious wealth and influence. The timing of Lamont's disappearance had been no accident. She had staged the crime to create chaos, to throw suspicion on those who might threaten her empire of rare, cursed artifacts and priceless paintings. The victim had been a carefully chosen pawn, someone who had no idea they would be used as a tool in Grant's deadly game. This individual had been positioned to take the fall for Lamont's death, while Grant moved behind the scenes to manipulate her social circle and increase her control over the valuable objects she had been hoarding. Hughes's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. The corpse painting, the strange gatherings, the high-stakes auctions, it was all part of a game to secure power, influence, and wealth. Eleanor Grant had not only used art as a tool for her own gain, but she had also carefully constructed a network of people who were too blinded by greed to see her true intentions. And now, she had manipulated the very people who had trusted her, setting them against each other and using them to further her own ends. But what truly struck Hughes was the realization that Grant's obsession had reached a point where it consumed everything around her. The hoax was just a small part of her larger plan, one that involved eliminating anyone who posed a threat to her carefully constructed empire. Lord Lamont had been a threat. His growing interest in uncovering the secrets behind her collection had put him in her crosshairs. He had become a liability, and so he had to be removed. But in doing so, Grant had set off a chain reaction that would ultimately lead to her undoing. As Hughes gathered the final evidence, he tracked Eleanor Grant to a secluded estate on the outskirts of the city, where she had planned to disappear with the stolen artifacts and paintings she had accumulated over the years. She had always been a step ahead, evading capture with her carefully honed ability to vanish into the shadows. But this time, Hughes was prepared. The confrontation came in the early hours of the morning, as Hughes and his team surrounded the estate. Grant, dressed in dark clothing, stood at the window, staring out at the sprawling garden below. She seemed calm, almost detached, as if she knew this moment was inevitable. Her empire had crumbled, but she would not go down without a final act of defiance. "I should have known it would be you," she said, her voice soft but laced with contempt. "You've been one step behind the whole time, Hughes. You've never understood the game, have you?" Hughes stepped forward, his eyes locked on hers. "I understand more than you think, Eleanor. This was never about art, was it? It was never about wealth. It was about control. And you're not the only one who can play games." Grant's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You think you've won? You've only scratched the surface. There are always more games to play. Always more secrets to uncover." Before Hughes could respond, Grant made a sudden, desperate move. She lunged for the case containing the stolen artifacts, the very treasures that had driven her to madness. But her greed had been her undoing. Hughes was faster, his hand reaching out to restrain her before she could escape with the stolen goods. The handcuffs clicked into place, and Grant's final gambit was over. With her arrest, the mystery was finally unraveled. Eleanor Grant was charged with a series of crimes, from orchestrating the hoax that led to Lord Lamont's disappearance, to the theft and trafficking of rare and dangerous artifacts. The victim, though never truly dead, was found and taken into protective custody, his identity carefully guarded to prevent any further harm. As Hughes walked away from the case, he couldn't help but reflect on Grant's final words. "There are always more games to play." It was a chilling reminder of the world he inhabited, a world where nothing was ever truly as it seemed, and where the players were always shifting, their motives hidden beneath layers of deception. For Hughes, it wasn't just the end of this case, it was the beginning of something more. In his line of work, there was no true closure, no real end. The games would continue, and the shadows would always loom large, waiting for the next move. The case of the vanishing corpse was a macabre testament to the extent one could go to in the pursuit of wealth, power, and control. What had begun as a seemingly straightforward mystery, a body found in a bath, only to vanish without a trace, had unraveled into a complex web of manipulation, deceit, and greed. Hughes had solved the riddle of the disappearing body. But the deeper layers of the case, the strange auction, the cursed art, and the obsession of Eleanor Grant, remained unsettling. Grant's empire had been built on the fragile foundation of art and deception, and Hughes could not shake the feeling that he had uncovered only a fraction of the darkness lurking beneath the surface. For Grant, the hoax had been just one in a long series of manipulations, all designed to safeguard her collection of rare and dangerous treasures. The body, the bloodstains, the paintings, they were all pieces in a twisted game that had nearly consumed everyone in its path. As Hughes walked away from the case, he reflected on the path that had brought him to this point. He had witnessed the lengths to which some individuals would go to protect their wealth and legacy, how they would manipulate lives, create false narratives, and erase the truth in order to maintain their grip on power. In the end, Eleanor Grant had been undone by her own obsession, her need to control and own everything, even at the cost of others' lives. For Hughes, the case was closed, but the truth was far from satisfying. He had exposed the mastermind behind the illusion, brought her to justice, and uncovered the secrets of the vanishing corpse. Yet the feeling of unease lingered, a reminder that in the world he navigated, things were never as simple as they seemed. The shadows of those dark circles, those secret gatherings, and the whispers of hidden art would continue to haunt him. They were ever present, lurking in the corners of his mind, waiting for the next mystery to emerge. The world Hughes inhabited was one of constant motion, where the games never truly ended and the truth was always shifting. Each case he solved seemed to open a door to a new labyrinth of secrets, and though he closed this chapter, he knew deep down that the shadows would always be there, waiting, watching, and perhaps whispering the next puzzle that only someone like him could solve. And so, as Hughes moved on to the next challenge, the specter of Eleanor Grant's warning echoed in his mind: there are always more games to play. The game, it seemed, was never truly over. Case 23, The Saint's Relic. Detective Stephen Raul Hughes was no stranger to the strange and unexplained. He had spent years unmasking the truth hidden beneath layers of deception, but this case, unlike any he had encountered before, felt different. It was as though fate itself had conspired to weave a web of mystery so thick that even Hughes, with his practiced eye, struggled to see through the strands. It all began with a simple letter. A cryptic invitation, stamped with the insignia of an ancient religious order. It was an invitation to witness the arrival of a sacred relic, something that had been in the possession of a secretive religious faction for centuries. The relic was a saint's remains, said to have miraculous powers. The wealthy order, known for their influence in mysterious dealings, had recently acquired it. After a lengthy restoration, they planned to place it in a newly built chapel, a sacred space that had been designed to house it with great reverence. The event had all the trappings of a grand spectacle. Invitations were extended to dignitaries, art collectors, and the religious elite. The anticipation was palpable, perhaps too much so. The night before the grand unveiling, Hughes received a call that would change everything. A local priest, Father Malvin, had been found dead in the chapel where the saint's relic was to be displayed. The body, cold and lifeless, was discovered by a custodian the next morning, his voice trembling as he spoke the grim words: "The priest, he's gone, and the altar, there's something there." The chapel itself was an impressive structure, a monument to faith and craftsmanship, its ornate windows casting flickers of colored light across the stone floor. But now, it seemed to mock the very ideals it was meant to honor. Father Malvin's body lay on the cold, hard stone, sprawled across the altar, a crude and violent symbol carved into the wood beneath him. A symbol, Hughes noted, that was eerily similar to a curse he'd seen referenced in some of the old religious texts he had studied during his university days. The symbol, a twisted amalgamation of sacred geometry, was too precise to be random, and too disturbing to ignore. There was no sign of a struggle. The priest's habit was pristine, save for the bloodstains that marred the fabric. His face bore a look of serenity, his eyes closed as though in deep prayer, yet the knife wound in his chest was unmistakable, deep and fatal. A single stab wound, and nothing else. No broken furniture, no displaced objects, not even a sign that anyone had entered or exited the chapel in a hurry. And the blood? It had pooled around him, as if he had been placed there after death, carefully, almost ritualistically. The only other clue in the room, apart from the disturbing symbol, was the presence of the saint's relic itself. A small, weathered wooden box, the size of a shoe, sat upon a velvet cushion at the foot of the altar. Despite its age, the box was intact, and the relic within it, supposedly the saint's bones, was nowhere to be found. The relic, which had been the focal point of the chapel's grand unveiling, had vanished. In its place, there was only silence, a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to hang in the air like a suffocating cloud. Hughes stood over the scene, his keen eyes absorbing every detail, his mind already piecing together the fragmented puzzle. The murder of Father Malvin, while tragic, seemed almost too neat. Too intentional. As if the killer had orchestrated the scene with the precision of a master, and yet, why? Why kill a man who was, by all accounts, a devout and humble priest? What role did the relic, and the holy order behind it, play in all of this? His first instinct was to question the religious order responsible for the chapel. The leader of the order, Brother Caden, was an enigmatic figure, well known for his austere and stoic demeanor. A man whose faith was unwavering, whose devotion to the church was beyond reproach. But Hughes knew from experience that people who held power, especially those who wielded it in the name of faith, often hid their true intentions behind carefully crafted masks. Upon arriving at the abbey where the order resided, Hughes was greeted by Brother Caden. The monk's cold eyes did not betray the warmth of hospitality, and his tight lips suggested a man accustomed to control. Hughes introduced himself and asked to be shown the chapel where the murder had taken place. As they walked through the stone corridors, the air was thick with the scent of incense, a stark contrast to the coldness that seemed to permeate the walls of the abbey. Brother Caden explained the significance of the relic with all the fervor of a man deeply invested in the preservation of his order's legacy. The saint, he explained, had been a martyr, someone who had sacrificed their life for the faith. The order had spent decades searching for the saint's remains, and now, finally, they had them. The relic was not only a symbol of divine power but a link to the past, a relic of immeasurable value. But Hughes, ever the skeptic, felt something off in Caden's words. The monk spoke of devotion, of faith, and of divine providence, but there was no mention of the darker rumors that surrounded the order. Whispers in the village had long spoken of the order's secretive nature, of its deep connections with the wealthiest and most powerful families in the region. Some said the relic was not simply a spiritual object, but a key to unlocking untold riches. Others claimed it held the power to influence the lives of those in positions of authority. Was it possible that the priest had been murdered because he had learned too much about the relic's true nature? As Hughes moved deeper into the investigation, it became clear that Father Malvin's death was not the first tragedy linked to the relic. The chapel, though newly built, had a long and troubled history. The land upon which it stood had once been a site of great religious conflict, where rival factions had clashed over the ownership of sacred artifacts. Were those conflicts still alive, hidden beneath the surface? Had the relic reignited old rivalries that had now spilled over into violence? The more Hughes learned, the more questions arose. The victim, Father Malvin, had been a man of faith, but he had also been something of a rebel. He had often spoken out against the Order's practices, questioning the motives of those in charge. He had opposed the idea of moving the relic to the new chapel, and had even gone so far as to argue publicly that it was wrong to treat a human being's remains as mere objects of worship. Was his death a result of this outspokenness? Or was it a much deeper conspiracy, one that reached into the very heart of the Order's power? The clues were few, and the suspects, though numerous, were cloaked in a veil of secrecy. Brother Caden, while seemingly above suspicion, could not be ruled out. But then there was the matter of the saint's relic, the missing bones. What role did they play in the puzzle? Was the relic, as some villagers suggested, cursed? Or was it merely a symbol of greed and manipulation? Hughes had no answers, only more questions. As Hughes stood in the chapel, surrounded by the stone walls that held the secrets of centuries, he knew this was no ordinary case. This wasn't just a murder, it was the beginning of something far darker. The relic's true power, its true significance, was still hidden beneath layers of lies and deceit. And Hughes was determined to uncover it. Even if the truth threatened to shatter everything he thought he knew about faith, power, and the price of devotion. The investigation had only just begun. Hughes arrived at the monastery as the early morning mist clung to the stone walls, making the place seem even more remote and secretive than it already was. The ancient abbey was perched on a hilltop, surrounded by vast stretches of forest, its spires piercing the misty sky like silent sentinels. The monks, draped in their humble brown habits, moved through the courtyard with quiet reverence, their faces a mixture of solemnity and routine. There was an air of peace here, but beneath it, Hughes could sense the tension, the weight of 1,000 secrets waiting to be uncovered. Father Malvin had spent the last years of his life here at the abbey, where his devotion to his faith was both admired and, at times, criticized. Hughes had already learned that the priest was deeply respected among the common folk, yet in the cloistered world of the monastery, his views had made him a polarizing figure. Malvin had long been suspicious of the religious order's growing obsession with the saint's relic, arguing that it had become less a symbol of faith and more a tool of power. He had feared that the veneration of the saint's bones would be nothing more than a way to line the coffers of the wealthy order. Some monks, it seemed, agreed with him, while others, particularly the younger members, were eager to elevate the relic to a place of absolute reverence. Hughes' investigation led him to Brother Aloy, a young monk with a passion for the relic and its supposed powers. Aloy, with his intense eyes and a brow furrowed in perpetual contemplation, seemed to be one of the most outspoken advocates for the relic's arrival at the chapel. Hughes had been told that the conflict between Aloy and Father Malvin had grown heated in the weeks leading up to the murder. The two had engaged in countless debates over the relic's importance and the role it should play in the future of the abbey. According to some of the older monks, Father Malvin had even gone so far as to suggest that the relic was being exploited for greed, something that could tarnish the sacred object's true power. The abbey's cloisters were quiet as Hughes made his way toward Aloy's chambers. The young monk greeted him at the door with a forced smile, his eyes flicking nervously as he ushered Hughes inside. The room was sparsely furnished, just a simple bed, a desk piled with books, and a window that offered a view of the rolling hills below. A faint smell of incense lingered in the air, and the soft light from the window cast long shadows across the stone walls. "Detective Hughes," Brother Aloy said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge of nervousness. "I've heard much about you. I assume you've come to ask about Father Malvin?" Hughes studied the monk's face, noting the tension in his jaw. The eagerness to discuss the priest's death, Hughes knew, often signaled a desire to deflect suspicion. "Yes," Hughes replied, his voice calm but probing. "I've learned that you and Father Malvin had disagreements about the relic. Can you tell me about those?" Aloy hesitated, as if considering how best to approach the topic. "Father Malvin was a good man," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "He meant well. But his ideas were troubling. The saint's relic is a symbol of divine power. It's not simply a relic, it's a connection to the divine, something that should inspire faith and devotion. But Father Malvin saw it as nothing more than an object for profit. He became obsessed with the idea that the order was using it to gain influence and wealth." "And you disagreed with him?" Hughes asked, watching Aloy closely. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, resentment. Perhaps a touch of guilt. "Yes," Aloy said, his voice sharpening. "I disagreed. The relic represents something much greater than any material gain. It is a sign of God's grace, not something to be questioned by men like Father Malvin. His ideas became dangerous. I feared he would turn others against the order." Hughes remained silent, carefully observing Aloy's response. There was an underlying anger in the monk's voice, but was it genuine conviction, or something darker? The way Aloy's eyes seemed to avoid direct contact when speaking about Malvin struck Hughes as odd, almost as if he were trying to convince himself more than Hughes. "Did you have any personal conflicts with Father Malvin?" Hughes asked, pushing further. Aloy stiffened slightly, his hands clenching at his sides. "We had debates, yes. But nothing personal. He just didn't understand the sacredness of the relic, and I believe that's why he became so obsessed with it. He feared what it could represent, its power. But Father Malvin didn't see the bigger picture. He was blinded by his own doubts." Hughes leaned forward slightly, sensing an opportunity. "And where were you on the night of Father Malvin's death?" Aloy paused, his eyes darting toward the door as if expecting someone to enter. His lips parted, but the words seemed to stick in his throat before he finally spoke. "I was in my cell, as I always am. Praying. I did not leave until morning." The answer was evasive, as Hughes had suspected. He nodded slowly, sensing Aloy's unease. The young monk's refusal to provide a direct, solid alibi left him with more questions than answers. "But you must understand," Aloy continued, his voice growing more desperate, "Father Malvin's death is a tragedy, and I didn't want him dead. He was a man of faith. But he couldn't see the truth of the relic. The relic is holy, Detective. It is not just bones, it is a link to something greater." Hughes watched him carefully, his mind racing through the implications of what Aloy had said. The monk's fervor was undeniable, but there was something almost fanatical about it, a hint of something obsessive that made Hughes wary. Could Aloy's devotion have driven him to violence? Or was he just too quick to distance himself from a man who had challenged his beliefs? Hughes made a mental note to dig deeper into Aloy's past, especially his connections to the relic. There was more to this monk than met the eye, and Hughes was certain that the key to understanding Father Malvin's murder lay within the monastery's walls. But would he be able to uncover the truth before it was buried forever under layers of faith and deceit? As Hughes left the monk's cell, the weight of the investigation pressed heavily on his shoulders. There was no shortage of suspects, and the secrets of the abbey seemed to stretch back further than anyone could have imagined. The relic, the murder, and the religious order's obsession with both had created a perfect storm of intrigue, and Hughes was determined to find its eye. The monk's words echoed in his mind. The relic is holy, a link to something greater. But Hughes knew that in a case like this, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The answers, if they existed at all, would be buried deep. And he would stop at nothing to uncover them. As Hughes dug deeper into the investigation, the complexity of the case began to unfurl before him. It wasn't just about a murder, no, the death of Father Malvin had become entangled in a far larger web of power, manipulation, and ambition. The saint's relic, so revered and so shrouded in mystery, was more than just a symbol of faith. To those who sought to control it, it was a tool, an object of immense influence and power. And Hughes, as always, was determined to uncover the truth. The more he learned about the relic, the more it seemed that its arrival had sparked a fevered competition within the abbey itself. Father Malvin had been one of the few voices speaking out against its acquisition, fearing the moral implications of elevating an object to such an exalted position. But there were others, too, those who believed the relic could secure the abbey's future, restoring its former prominence and bringing an influx of wealth and donations from the wealthy benefactors eager to get close to the divine. The abbey had long been a place of worship and devotion, but in the wake of Father Malvin's death, Hughes realized that the stakes had grown far higher. The relic had been promised to the abbey by a wealthy benefactor, an influential noble who had ties to both the religious and political elites. This promise, however, came with strings attached. The relic wasn't just a gift, it was a means to an end. The current abbot, Father Nestor, had spent decades attempting to secure this relic, convinced that it would guarantee the abbey's survival and bring prosperity to their cause. It wasn't just the relic itself that Father Nestor desired, but the power that came with it. The abbey had fallen into financial ruin over the years, its influence waning in a world that was rapidly changing. The relic, however, could restore its former glory, bringing in pilgrims, wealthy donors, and a resurgence of religious fervor. But not everyone agreed with Father Nestor's vision. There were factions within the church that believed the abbot was too eager to commodify the relic, to exploit its power for personal gain. These dissenters saw the abbot's plans as sacrilegious, reducing a sacred object to a mere means of securing wealth and control. Father Malvin had been one of the most vocal critics of this approach, warning that the relic's arrival would only lead to division, greed, and corruption within the abbey. For Hughes, the deeper he dug, the clearer it became that Father Malvin's murder wasn't just about one man's ideological opposition, it was about the very heart of the abbey's future. Father Malvin had known too much, had spoken too openly about the dangers of bringing the relic to the chapel. In a place like the abbey, where power was both spiritual and temporal, that kind of opposition could not go unpunished. It was clear that someone within the abbey had felt threatened by Malvin's defiance. Hughes suspected that the murder wasn't a crime of passion but a cold, calculated move to eliminate an obstacle in a larger power struggle. Whoever had orchestrated the priest's death had done so to ensure that nothing stood in the way of the relic's arrival and the control it would bring. The more Hughes thought about it, the more he saw the pattern emerging. The abbot had made powerful enemies, and the arrival of the relic had only intensified the conflict. Yet there was still one crucial piece missing, the role of the other monks. Were they also caught up in their own ambitions that they could kill in the name of faith? Or was there someone more sinister at play, someone using the abbey's internal divisions to their own advantage? Hughes knew he had to speak to Father Nestor, to understand the full scope of the abbot's ambitions and whether he could have been involved in Father Malvin's death. But before he could make any moves, a disturbing new lead emerged, a letter, unsigned but unmistakably linked to the power struggle within the abbey. The letter was addressed to the abbot, warning him to abandon his plans for the relic. It spoke of a curse, of dark forces at work, and suggested that the saint's remains were not to be trifled with. The tone was cryptic, almost threatening, and it seemed to imply that anyone who sought to control the relic would pay a heavy price. Hughes read the letter carefully, feeling the weight of its words. Whoever had written it knew far too much about the inner workings of the abbey and its divisions. Was it a warning from one of the dissenting monks? Or was it something more ominous, an indication that the relic itself had a darker power than anyone could imagine? The letter only added to the growing sense of unease Hughes felt as he continued his investigation. The mystery of Father Malvin's death was becoming more complex by the hour, and the shadows of ambition, greed, and faith seemed to close in around him. With each new discovery, Hughes realized that this case was about far more than just a murder. It was about a battle for the very soul of the abbey and its future. As Hughes prepared to confront Father Nestor, he couldn't shake the feeling that the abbot was hiding something. Could he have been behind Father Malvin's death? Or was there another player in this deadly game, one whose ambition was even more dangerous than the abbot's? The path ahead was fraught with danger, and Hughes knew that the truth would be buried deep within the abbey's walls, hidden behind layers of faith and deceit. But he was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The relic, the murder, and the power struggle were all linked, and Hughes would stop at nothing to reveal the truth, no matter who he had to confront, or what he had to sacrifice. The deeper Detective Hughes delved into the mystery surrounding Father Malvin's murder, the darker and more complex the investigation became. As he continued to follow the threads of the case, he uncovered a troubling truth that could shatter the foundation of the abbey and expose a scandal that had been buried for centuries. The breakthrough came when Hughes discovered that Father Malvin had been researching the true origins of the saint's relics. The document he had uncovered was a shocking revelation. It detailed how the saint's remains, which were believed to be holy and sacred, had not been passed down through pious means. Instead, they had been stolen from another monastery long ago under murky circumstances. If the truth of this theft were revealed, it could ruin the reputations of everyone involved in securing the relic, both within the abbey and the powerful individuals who had helped facilitate its acquisition. Father Malvin had been disturbed by the implications of this discovery. He had begun quietly investigating the origins of the relic, determined to uncover the truth despite the risk it posed to his own safety. But the deeper he dug, the more he attracted the attention of those who had a vested interest in keeping the saint's bones, and their origins, secret. It didn't take long for Hughes to learn that Brother Aloy had been one of the last people to speak with Father Malvin. The young monk's connection to the relic's acquisition was becoming more suspicious with each passing day. Aloy had been vocal in his support for the saint's arrival at the abbey, and his fervent belief in the relic's power was seen by some as bordering on obsession. But Hughes now began to suspect that Aloy's passion for the relic was more than just a matter of faith, it was about protection. Brother Aloy had known about the secret document and had been in contact with a group of powerful individuals who had a strong interest in keeping the relic's origins concealed. These individuals, as Hughes uncovered, were no mere clergy or simple lay people. They were influential figures within the church who were tied to the abbey's history and finances. Some were former monks, now in positions of power, who had once been involved in the acquisition of the relic, while others were wealthy benefactors who had helped fund its journey to the abbey. The secret they were hiding was not just about a theft, it was about their role in it. Father Malvin had posed a direct threat to them by digging into the relic's past. Hughes learned from his contacts that the priest had been warned several times to stop his investigation. Brother Aloy had been one of those who had attempted to silence him, using gentle persuasion at first and, when that failed, more overt threats. The final confrontation, however, had been far more sinister. The night Father Malvin was murdered, he had been alone in his quarters with the document he had uncovered. Hughes believed that the priest had been killed to prevent him from exposing the secret, and that the murder had been planned well in advance. It was clear now that Father Malvin's death wasn't a mere act of passion or religious disagreement. It was a calculated effort to protect the dark history behind the relic and the people who had helped secure it. With this new information, Hughes' suspicions turned to Brother Aloy. The monk had been in contact with the individuals who had the most to lose from the revelation of the relic's origins. Aloy's deep belief in the sanctity of the saint's bones was perhaps less about faith than it was about a need to protect his own interests and those of the powerful men and women who had a hand in acquiring the relic. But was Aloy the one who had actually killed Father Malvin? Or had he simply been a pawn in a much larger game? Hughes also considered the possibility that there was a deeper conspiracy at play, one that involved the highest echelons of the abbey and the religious order. Could Father Nestor, the abbot, have been aware of the document's existence? Did he play a role in silencing Father Malvin, or was he himself caught in a struggle for control over the relic, unaware of the full extent of the conspiracy? The more Hughes uncovered, the more tangled the investigation became. Every new piece of evidence raised more questions than answers. The saint's relic, it seemed, was a symbol of much more than just faith. It was a key to power, and those who sought to control it were willing to go to any lengths to keep its secrets hidden. Hughes knew he needed to speak to Brother Aloy again, but this time with a more direct approach. Aloy had been too evasive before, too eager to deny any involvement in the priest's death. Hughes suspected that the monk was hiding something, perhaps even something as damning as his direct participation in the murder. But what exactly was Aloy's role in all of this? And what had driven him to protect such a dark secret? Before Hughes could formulate a plan to confront Aloy, an unexpected turn of events interrupted his investigation. One of the abbey's benefactors, an influential nobleman with ties to the church, was found dead under mysterious circumstances, his body left in the chapel where the saint's relic was to be displayed. The circumstances surrounding his death mirrored Father Malvin's, though this time, there was no sign of struggle, and the body was positioned in a way that seemed almost ceremonial. Hughes could not ignore the possibility that the two deaths were connected. The nobleman had been deeply involved in the relic's acquisition, and his death raised further questions about the lengths people were willing to go to in order to protect their secrets. Was it possible that the murder of Father Malvin had been part of a larger plan, one that involved eliminating anyone who might threaten the relic's place in the abbey? As Hughes stood over the nobleman's body, he couldn't shake the feeling that the investigation had just entered a much darker phase. The secrets of the abbey were becoming more dangerous to uncover, and the people involved in the conspiracy were growing desperate. The truth was buried deep within the abbey's walls, hidden behind layers of faith, politics, and greed. But Hughes was undeterred. He knew that he had to continue his pursuit of the truth, no matter where it led. The abbey's dark secrets would eventually come to light, and those responsible for the deaths of Father Malvin and the nobleman would be held accountable. But to do so, Hughes would have to navigate the treacherous waters of power, deception, and a belief system that had been manipulated for centuries. The chapel was eerily silent as Detective Raul Hughes stepped inside, his footsteps echoing against the cold stone walls. The saint's relic was positioned at the altar, its bones shrouded in mystery and reverence, just as it had been when Father Malvin had been killed. Hughes had come to this sacred space to confront Brother Aloy, and he knew that the moment of truth had arrived. Aloy was already there, standing near the altar, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. His face was pale, and his eyes darted nervously to the door as Hughes entered. The monk had been expecting this confrontation. He had known that Hughes was closing in on the truth, and now there was nowhere to hide. "You knew it would come to this," Hughes said, his voice calm yet unwavering. "I've uncovered everything, Brother Aloy. I know what you did." For a long moment, Aloy said nothing. His breath came in short gasps, and his trembling hands betrayed his anxiety. Finally, he spoke, his voice a mixture of fear and determination. "I did what I had to do," Aloy said, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and defiance. "Father Malvin was a threat to everything we've worked for. The relic, it wasn't just a piece of history. It was our future. Without it, the Abbey would crumble. We would lose everything we've built." Hughes stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Aloy. "You killed him to protect a lie. To protect the Abbey's reputation, to protect the relic. But you're forgetting something important, Brother Aloy. It was never the relic that gave the Abbey power, it was the people. People like Father Malvin, who believed in truth, in faith, even when it meant confronting uncomfortable realities." Aloy flinched, as if the words had struck him harder than anything Hughes could say. "You don't understand," Aloy whispered, his voice cracking. "You don't understand the pressure, the fear. The Abbey was struggling. The relic would have brought wealth and influence. It would have restored us to our rightful place in the world. I couldn't let that go. The truth would have destroyed us." "I understand more than you think," Hughes replied. "But no amount of wealth, no amount of power, can justify taking a life. Father Malvin was trying to protect the Abbey's soul, something that can never be bought or hidden behind falsehoods." Aloy's eyes filled with tears, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his actions. "I didn't want to kill him, but he wouldn't stop asking questions. He was getting too close. If he had found out the truth about the relic's origins, everything would have fallen apart. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let the Abbey be destroyed." Hughes watched the young monk, seeing the mixture of regret and conviction in his eyes. "You believed you were saving the Abbey," he said quietly, "but in reality, you were destroying it from within. The relic, the lies, they were never going to protect you. They only brought ruin." Aloy sank to his knees, his hands pressed to his forehead in a gesture of defeat. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought." "I know," Hughes interrupted softly. "You thought you were protecting something worth more than the truth. But in the end, it was the truth that would have saved the Abbey, and now you've destroyed it." The monk sobbed quietly, the weight of his actions finally crashing down upon him. Hughes stood in silence for a moment, allowing Aloy the space to process his guilt. The confession was complete, but the emotional toll of the case was far from over. Hughes knew that justice had to be served, and Aloy would face the consequences of his actions. But in the back of his mind, the detective couldn't help but feel a sense of melancholy. The relic, once a symbol of faith and devotion, had become a tool of corruption and manipulation. And now, it had claimed a life, not just that of Father Malvin, but also of Brother Aloy, who had lost his soul in the process. As Hughes prepared to leave the chapel, the finality of the case settled over him. The truth had been uncovered, but at a great cost. The saint's relic, now tainted by the bloodshed that had surrounded it, would be moved to a new location. But the history of its acquisition and the death it had caused would remain forever etched in the memories of those involved. Father Malvin had sought the truth, and in the end, the truth had prevailed, but not without sacrifice. Hughes walked out of the chapel, the heavy door creaking behind him. The case was closed, but the questions lingered. The cost of seeking the truth was often higher than anyone could predict, and in this case, the Abbey's dark secrets had taken a toll on everyone it touched. As he made his way back to the village, Hughes couldn't help but reflect on the strange and tragic journey that had brought him to this point. Sometimes, the pursuit of justice led down unexpected paths, and sometimes, the answers were more difficult to bear than the questions. But no matter how high the price, Hughes knew that the truth was always worth seeking, no matter the cost. Case 24, The Lost Echoes. Detective Stephen Raul Hughes had always found comfort in the structured patterns of his work. Crime scenes, investigations, and the cold logic of uncovering truths, that was where he thrived. However, there were cases that stirred something deeper in him, pulling at the corners of his mind in ways he couldn't quite understand. The case of Iris Larkin was one of those. It wasn't just that the girl had disappeared. It was the atmosphere surrounding her disappearance that unsettled Hughes. There was a weight to it, a feeling that stretched far beyond the surface of the crime itself. The town of Eastfield, where the girl lived, seemed to hang on the edge of reality, a place where history had stopped moving and where time itself felt like it had been held in a suspended animation. Iris had vanished from the woods. The woods. It was a place that was far more than just a patch of trees. To the townspeople, it was a haunted expanse, a forest wrapped in local legend. Stories of lost children, strange occurrences, and unsettling whispers filled the air whenever the town's elders spoke of it. And it was there, in that very patch of woods, where Iris Larkin had been last seen. Hughes's mind wandered back to his own past, to memories that he had spent years trying to bury. He had grown up in a town not unlike Eastfield. He had heard the same rumors, played in the same woods as a child. But his memories of those years were clouded, shaded by an event he had never fully understood. It was this connection, this haunting familiarity, that made Iris's case feel different from any other. The weight of those childhood memories clung to him, taunting him in the dark corners of his mind. When Hughes arrived in Eastfield, the town seemed to envelope him like a suffocating fog. The streets were narrow, the buildings old, their stone walls crumbling in places where time had taken its toll. He was greeted by the sheriff, a short, stocky man named Paul Jenkins, who looked at Hughes with a mixture of hope and weariness. "I appreciate you coming," Jenkins said, his voice heavy with the burden of too many years spent dealing with the town's troubles. "But I have to warn you, things aren't normal around here. There's something about this place, something people don't talk about." Hughes nodded, his sharp gaze taking in the town's quiet streets and the solemn faces of the locals. They watched him with a mixture of curiosity and unease, their eyes following him as if expecting something terrible to unfold. It was as if the town itself knew something Hughes didn't, and they were waiting for him to discover it. He'd been to enough small towns in his career to recognize the subtle language of silence. In Eastfield, that silence spoke volumes. People went about their business with an air of caution, as if a misstep could uncover something they weren't ready to face. In the tavern, which was little more than a ramshackle building with a weather-beaten sign, The low murmur of conversation ceased when Hughes entered. The locals exchanged nervous glances, their voices lowering, then falling silent. It was clear they weren't used to strangers, let alone a detective poking around their affairs. "Have you found any signs of Iris?" Hughes asked, looking around the room. Jenkins hesitated. "Nothing substantial. Just the usual stories." Hughes's brow furrowed. "Stories?" The sheriff took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for a difficult confession. "Eastfield has its history. People talk about the woods. Strange things happen there. Children disappearing, folks vanishing without a trace. It's been like that for generations." "That's superstition," one of the older men at the bar interrupted, his voice thick with alcohol. "You can't let yourself get tangled up in those old tales." But Hughes wasn't so sure. He'd heard similar stories before, stories that turned out to have a kernel of truth buried within them. The question wasn't whether the woods held secrets, but rather what kind of secrets they had. Something about this case felt different from the usual run-of-the-mill disappearances he had seen in his time. This was personal, deeply rooted in something far older than just a missing girl. The sheriff continued, "There's an old rumor about a group of children, back in the 60s. They went missing. The woods were different then. Some folks say the trees change, shift, even. People say the town's cursed, that it draws people in, then swallows them whole." Hughes could sense that the sheriff was holding something back, something important. He had heard the same sorts of things before in his career, local folklore and whispered tales that only seemed to deepen the mystery. But there was an undercurrent of truth in Jenkins's words, one that Hughes couldn't ignore. Whatever had happened to Iris, it had happened here, in Eastfield, and it was connected to the woods. The deeper Hughes dug into the history of Eastfield, the more he began to uncover. The town's founding was steeped in myth, dating back to the late 1700s. According to old records, the first settlers had built their homes near the edge of the forest, drawn to its rich resources and seclusion. But over the years, strange occurrences began to plague the community, unexplained disappearances, strange sightings in the woods, and odd happenings that seemed to tie the townspeople to the forest. He spoke with Iris's parents, who were frantic but strangely passive about their daughter's disappearance. Iris was always drawn to the woods, her mother, Clara, said, wringing her hands. She'd go out there alone, sometimes for hours. I never understood it, but she loved it, loved the stillness. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, and Hughes noticed the way her hands trembled. Her father, Thomas, added, she was always a quiet girl. We tried to keep her away from the woods, but she'd always go back. Said she saw things out there. Things no one else could. Hughes leaned in, sensing a deeper layer to their words. What things? Both parents exchanged a look before Clara spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She said there were voices, things that watched her. But she never told anyone what it was. I think she was afraid. The townspeople's reluctance to talk was becoming more apparent. They knew something, but it was as if they had collectively agreed to bury the past. In the tavern, Hughes could sense the eyes that followed him as he left, the way every conversation stopped when he entered the room. No one was willing to talk about what had happened to Iris, but they were all aware of it, of the girl who had disappeared, just like the children before her. As Hughes continued his investigation, he realized that Iris's disappearance was not just another case, it was a part of something much larger. Something older. The woods, the town, and the people, they were all connected in ways Hughes was only beginning to understand. The whispers of the past were louder now, and Hughes could almost hear them calling to him as he walked down the shadowed streets of Eastfield. Whatever secrets the town held, they were buried deep within the earth, and Hughes was getting closer to uncovering them. But with each step, the mystery grew more elusive, more dangerous. The woods were waiting for him, watching him, and soon, Hughes would have to confront the truth hidden within them. The air in Eastfield had always felt heavy, but now, as Hughes entered the forest, it became almost suffocating. There was a dampness to the air, thick with the smell of moss and decaying leaves, as if the woods themselves were ancient, unwilling to let go of their secrets. The trees, old and twisted, stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like fingers, shading the path ahead. Each step Hughes took seemed to echo in the silence, and yet, there was an odd stillness, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. He walked deeper into the woods, following the rough outline of the path where Iris Larkin had last been seen. The ground beneath him was soft, spongy, a mixture of fallen leaves and damp earth. It felt unnatural, this quietness, as if the trees themselves were waiting for something, or someone, to disturb their peace. Hughes couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were more than just a backdrop to the case. There was something alive here, something ancient that resisted being forgotten. He reached the clearing where Iris had disappeared. It was small, only about 20 feet across, with thick underbrush on all sides. A single beam of light filtered through the canopy above, illuminating the center of the clearing where the ground was uneven and disturbed. Hughes knelt down, his eyes scanning the earth carefully. He wasn't expecting to find much, but his instincts had been honed over years of investigation, and they were telling him there was more to this than met the eye. There were scratches on the ground, barely noticeable but present nonetheless. They weren't deep, but they formed patterns, lines that curved in odd directions. The soil was loose here, as if something had been dragged through it. Hughes ran his fingers over the marks, feeling the texture of the earth beneath his fingertips. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no footprints, just the faintest trace of something being moved. He stood up, taking in his surroundings. The absence of any concrete evidence was unsettling, but he knew better than to dismiss the seemingly insignificant. There was something here, just beyond reach, something that Iris had known, something that had drawn her into this place. The clues were as fleeting as the whispers he had heard in the town, there one moment, gone the next. Hughes stayed in the clearing for a while longer, letting the silence of the woods seep into his bones. He could feel the eyes of the forest on him, the pressure building, but it wasn't enough to break him. He had seen too much to be easily unnerved, yet there was something about this place, this town, that was starting to gnaw at him. The next day, Hughes returned to Eastfield, his mind swirling with unanswered questions. He had found nothing concrete in the woods, but his gut told him there was more. It was time to dig deeper into the town's history. He began with the oldest residents, those who had been around long enough to remember the early days of Eastfield. Their stories were fragmented, their recollections hazy, but Hughes began to piece together a strange pattern. Over the decades, children had gone missing in Eastfield, almost like clockwork. Every few years, a child would simply vanish without a trace, leaving behind grieving parents in a town filled with unanswered questions. Each disappearance was written off as a tragic accident, a child who had wandered off or run away. But the dates were strange, the timing too regular, and Hughes began to wonder if there was something more sinister at work. One of the older women he spoke to, Mrs. Agnes Langley, had lived in Eastfield her entire life. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were sharp, filled with the clarity of someone who had witnessed far too many things. She remembered the first disappearance, back in the 1950s, when she was just a girl. There were whispers then, she said, her voice low, as though the very mention of it could stir up the past. Whispers about the woods, about the lost children. People thought it was just a curse, but I've always wondered if it was more than that. Hughes leaned forward, sensing that Mrs. Langley knew something she wasn't saying. "What do you mean, more than that?" he asked. She hesitated, glancing around as if checking to make sure no one else could hear. The disappearances, they always happened at the same time of year. The leaves were changing, the air growing colder. There were stories about the woods, about things that lived there, things that didn't want to be disturbed. People thought it was superstition, but I don't know. I think there's something in those woods, something that calls to the children, something that takes them. Hughes felt a chill creep down his spine. He had heard the term lost children mentioned in passing by Iris's parents, but now, it seemed to take on a far darker significance. The town had buried its past, but it was beginning to resurface, one layer at a time. He pressed on, speaking with other townspeople, many of whom had grown up in Eastfield. There were murmurs about children disappearing every few years, following a pattern that no one had ever questioned. But when Hughes asked about the specifics, when he pushed for details, the town grew silent. There was a palpable tension, an unwillingness to confront the truth. It was as if the residents feared what the answers might reveal. In the town tavern, Hughes overheard a conversation between two older men, their voices low and conspiratorial. "You think he'll get to the bottom of it?" one man asked. "I don't know," the other replied. "But there are things that are better left buried. Some things shouldn't be dug up. The town's been quiet for a long time. We don't want to stir up the past." Hughes's mind raced as he listened to their exchange. The town's fear wasn't just about the disappearance of Iris, it was about the past itself. The history of Eastfield, the unsolved disappearances, and the eerie woods, they were all linked together in a way that the town wasn't willing to confront. But Hughes knew that the past couldn't stay buried forever. And the more he uncovered, the clearer it became that the woods held the answers he was searching for. Later that night, he sat in his small room at the local inn, reviewing his notes. He thought about the pattern of disappearances, the strange connection to the changing seasons, and the cryptic remarks of the townspeople. It was all too much to ignore. But there was one thing that was gnawing at him, something that he couldn't yet put into words. Iris's disappearance had felt like the beginning of something, a new chapter in a story that had been unfolding for decades. The town had tried to bury the truth, to sweep it under the rug, but Hughes was determined to uncover it. The woods were waiting. They had always been waiting. The next day, Hughes would return to the forest, armed with new knowledge and a growing suspicion. He knew that whatever lay hidden in those woods would be the key to solving Iris's disappearance, and to unlocking the dark, buried secrets of Eastfield. The breakthrough came on a dreary morning when Hughes decided to venture out to the outskirts of Eastfield. The town's quaint charm had begun to wear thin, and he was feeling the weight of the mystery bearing down on him. The small, abandoned farmhouse he found was a relic of Eastfield's forgotten past, a place that had been left to the elements and to time's relentless grip. No one in town spoke of it anymore, though Hughes had heard passing mentions of the old house from some of the more senior residents. They said it was cursed, that it had been witness to too many tragedies, too many dark secrets. The farmhouse sat on a hill, its windows boarded up and its door hanging loosely on rusted hinges. Despite the town's collective attempt to forget it, the house stood like a monument to the past, waiting to reveal its truths. Hughes stepped inside, the door creaking loudly as he pushed it open. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of decay, but Hughes didn't mind. He had learned long ago that some of the most important answers were hidden in the places most people feared to tread. The attic was the first place he explored. The steps creaked under his weight, the wood groaning in protest. As he reached the top, the faint sound of wind whistling through cracks in the walls greeted him. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten relics of lives that had long since passed. But Hughes's trained eyes went straight to a large chest tucked away in a corner, its hinges rusted but still intact. He opened it carefully, dust swirling around him as he lifted the lid. Inside, he found a collection of old journals, photographs, and faded documents. Some of the pages were yellowed with age, their ink barely legible. As Hughes rifled through the materials, he noticed several photographs that seemed oddly familiar. One in particular caught his attention, a photograph of a group of children standing in front of a massive oak tree in the woods. The image was black and white, faded with time, but the expressions on the children's faces were unmistakable. Some looked nervous, others intrigued, but all shared a sense of tension. The most chilling part of the photograph was the presence of a girl with dark hair standing near the center of the group. She was staring directly into the camera, and Hughes couldn't shake the feeling that she resembled Iris. Hughes's heart skipped a beat. The photograph had to be decades old, and yet the resemblance between the girl in the picture and Iris was uncanny. He carefully set the photo down and continued to examine the contents of the chest. Among the other photographs were faded letters and handwritten journals, accounts from people who had lived through the tragedy that had haunted the town so many years ago. The journals detailed the disappearances of children from the very same woods that now seemed to claim Iris. As Hughes pored over the yellowed pages, he uncovered something chilling. The children in the photograph were part of a group that had gone missing many years before, disappearing from the same woods under eerily similar circumstances. The town had tried to bury the story, just as it had tried to bury so many others, but the truth had a way of resurfacing. The children were never found, their bodies never recovered, and their families had been left to grieve in silence. The case had gone cold, as many others had before it, but Hughes now realized that Iris's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, one that had been unfolding for decades. The connection was undeniable. Iris had unknowingly been drawn into the same tragic cycle that had claimed the children before her. The similarities between her disappearance and those of the others were too striking to ignore. The town had tried to erase the past, to forget the lost children who had wandered into the woods, but Hughes knew better than to believe in coincidences. As he sat in the dim attic, the weight of the discovery settled heavily on his chest. The town of Eastfield was hiding something far darker than he had initially suspected. It wasn't just the forest that held the key to Iris's disappearance, it was the town itself. The residents had long been afraid to speak of the past, but Hughes now understood why. The woods were a place of power, a place that had taken children in the past and had once again claimed one of their own. The fear that had gripped the townspeople wasn't just born from superstition, it was rooted in a deep-seated truth that no one wanted to confront. There was something ancient in the woods, something that had claimed the lives of innocent children in a cyclical pattern. The town's reluctance to speak of it wasn't born from ignorance, but from terror, a fear that whatever had taken the children all those years ago had not been vanquished. It was still there, in the trees, in the earth, in the very air of Eastfield. And now it had come for Iris. Hughes stood up, a sense of unease growing within him. The puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place, but the bigger picture was more horrifying than he had anticipated. The town had buried its dark history, hoping that the passage of time would silence the whispers of the past. But time had only deepened the wounds. Hughes had now become part of a story much older than he had expected, a story that was far from finished. The journals in the chest detailed the disappearances and the strange events that had plagued Eastfield for years. Some of the accounts spoke of visions and strange noises in the woods, of shadows moving among the trees, and of whispers that called to children in the night. There were even mentions of an ancient ritual, one that had been performed long ago in the forest. A ritual that some believed had given the woods its power. The townspeople had tried to forget the ritual, but it seemed the woods had not. Hughes closed the chest and carefully carried the journals back to his car. He would need to study them more thoroughly, but one thing was clear: this was no ordinary missing persons case. The past had returned to haunt the present, and the woods had claimed another victim. Iris's disappearance was just the latest chapter in a long and tragic history that had yet to be written. As Hughes drove back into town, his mind raced. The pieces were fitting together, but there were still gaps. He needed to confront the people of Eastfield, to make them face the truth they had been running from for decades. The woods were waiting, and so was the truth. It was time to dig deeper. The past was not as buried as they had hoped. It was alive, and it was coming for them all. The night was eerily still when Hughes drove his car down the narrow, winding road that led to the woods. His mind was a tangled web of thoughts, his heart pounding in anticipation of what he might find. After days of investigation, he had finally reached the moment he'd both feared and expected. There was no more running from it. The truth had been waiting for him, patient, just beyond the veil. The dense trees loomed over him like dark sentinels, their branches stretching across the sky in a twisted embrace. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of years gone by, each passing breeze whispering secrets that Hughes couldn't quite catch. As he stepped out of the car, the familiar crunch of leaves underfoot seemed louder than usual, the sound sharp in the silence of the night. The world felt distant, as if he had crossed into another reality, one where the laws of time and reason no longer applied. He had returned to the clearing where Iris had been last seen, the place where everything seemed to have begun, and where everything would now end. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, unsettling shadows that seemed to dance across the forest floor. Hughes paused, his senses heightened, as though the woods themselves were waiting for him. There was no mistaking it now, the trees were watching. And they weren't alone. In the center of the clearing, Hughes found her. Iris Larkin was standing motionless, her back to him, staring into the depths of the forest. The sight of her made his heart catch in his throat. She wasn't a victim of some cruel fate, but something else. She wasn't lost, at least, not in the way he had thought. No, she had found something here. Something that called to her, just as it had called to the others. Iris, Hughes called, his voice soft but firm. She didn't turn to look at him. Her body was still, as though she were rooted to the ground, unable or unwilling to break free from whatever strange pull the woods had on her. "I know you're here," Hughes said, taking a few cautious steps closer. His gaze flicked to the ground. There were no signs of struggle, no signs that she had been forcibly taken. It was as if she had simply chosen to walk into the woods and never come back. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Iris spoke, her voice distant, as if coming from far away. "They won't let me leave," she whispered. "I can't go back. I can't." Hughes's heart tightened in his chest. He was close now, closer than he had ever been to understanding the truth behind Iris's disappearance. The answer was here, in the silence of the forest and in the deep, unsettled air. "Iris, what happened to you? Why are you still here?" She turned to face him then, her eyes wide and hollow, as though she had seen something far beyond the boundaries of the world Hughes knew. The girl he had once known, the girl who had laughed and played like any other child, was no longer the same. There was something in her gaze, something in the way she held herself, that spoke of an experience far beyond her years. "The woods," she said, her voice trembling. "They don't want to let me go. They've taken others before me, and now they want me to stay." Hughes felt a chill run down his spine, but he didn't step back. He had to know the truth. "What do you mean, Iris? What is it that they want?" She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the trees around them. For a moment, Hughes thought she might not answer, but then she spoke again, her words barely above a whisper. "They're waiting. The woods, they don't forget. The lost children, they come back. Not as children, but as something else. Part of the forest. Part of its history. It's always been this way. And now I am one of them." The weight of her words hit Hughes like a physical blow. He had always suspected that there was more to Eastfield than met the eye, but hearing it from Iris herself was something else entirely. The woods were more than just a place. They were a force, an ancient, malevolent presence that had been drawing children into its depths for generations. And Iris had become part of it, just as the others before her had. Hughes felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He understood now that this wasn't just about Iris, it wasn't even just about the town. This was about something older, something beyond their control. The lost children weren't just victims of some twisted fate, they were drawn to the woods for reasons that no one had ever fully understood. And now Iris had joined them. "The woods," Hughes said softly, "they've been calling you." Iris nodded, her expression distant. "It's always been this way. The town, they pretend it's all superstition. They want to forget. But I remember now. I remember the others. The ones who were taken. They don't ever leave. Not really." As Hughes stood there, the truth began to sink in. The pattern of disappearances that had haunted Eastfield for decades wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't random. It was something much older, a curse, or perhaps a pact, that had bound the town to the forest. Each time a child was taken, they became part of something far darker. They became echoes of the past, trapped in the woods forever, unable to break free. The town had tried to bury its history, but it had never gone away. It had simply waited, patient, until the next child wandered into its grasp. In that moment, Hughes realized that the truth he had uncovered wasn't something that could be solved or fixed. It was a cycle, one that had been repeating for generations, and one that would continue long after he was gone. Some things, no matter how much we yearn to understand them, are beyond our reach. "Iris," Hughes said gently, stepping closer. "You don't have to stay here. You can come back." But Iris's eyes remained fixed on the forest. The pull of the woods was too strong, too ancient. I can't. It's too late for me." With those final words, Iris turned and disappeared into the darkness of the trees. Hughes watched as she melted into the shadows, no longer the lost girl he had once known, but something else entirely, something beyond the realm of human understanding. Hughes stood in the clearing long after she was gone, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. He had solved the mystery of Iris's disappearance, but in doing so, he had uncovered a truth that was far more terrifying than he could have imagined. The woods of Eastfield held more than just memories, they held power, a power that claimed the children of the town and kept them locked in its grasp. And now, Hughes knew, the cycle would continue. Because in Eastfield, some things could never be buried. They would always come back. Always. The case was over, but the truth was far from settled. Some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. Some shadows, no matter how hard you tried, could never be chased away. The case of Iris Larkin was officially closed, but the truth Hughes had unearthed was anything but a resolution. It had unraveled an ancient, unseen force lurking beneath the surface of Eastfield, a force that had claimed the lives of innocent children for generations. The woods, dark and mysterious, still held their secrets, and the town would continue to carry the weight of those forgotten tragedies in its bones. As Hughes sat in his car, parked at the edge of the woods, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the echoes of the past. He glanced back at the town in the distance, the lights of Eastfield flickering like fading memories. For all its efforts to bury the truth, the town had never truly escaped its history. It was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to pull the next soul into its grasp. For Hughes, the case had left an indelible mark. The image of Iris's hollow eyes haunted him long after the investigation was over. He had solved the puzzle, yes, but in doing so, he had uncovered a far more terrifying truth, one that would remain with him for the rest of his life. There were some mysteries that, no matter how hard you tried, could never be fully understood. Some things, some places, were simply beyond the realm of reason. As he drove away from Eastfield, the weight of the case settled over him like a fog, thick and oppressive. The town would continue on, as it always had, its residents oblivious to the ancient power that hung over them. But Hughes knew better. He knew that the past was never truly gone. It was always waiting, always calling, and it would come back sooner or later. Some cases didn't have answers. Some cases didn't have neat, tidy conclusions. They left behind more questions than they solved. And perhaps that was the most unsettling truth of all. The road stretched before him, dark and endless, and Hughes drove into the night, knowing that, for him, the search for truth was never truly over. There would always be another case, another mystery. But some shadows, no matter how hard you chased them, could never be outrun.
Some ghosts don't haunt, they hunt. You've just heard episode 5 of the case files of Detective S.R.H. Cases 21 to 24, written by me, Raul, for Audible Archives. If you're still following the trail, like, comment, and subscribe, because what's coming next changes everything. And so, the tale draws to a close, but the echoes remain here in the Audible Archives. And until our next journey through shadow and story, keep listening, keep wondering, because every ending hides another beginning. Audible Archives, where stories never sleep.